One of the most extreme forms of capitalism in the world. That's the verdict from a new report on the future of business by the British Academy. It makes the case for urgent reform of companies here, with a shift in emphasis from making profits for shareholders to a wider purpose for the benefit of society. So is our form of capitalism really that extreme? And do we need to fundamentally change the way that business works? With me now, Vimla Apadu. She's Digital Service Lead at Digital Bridge and is speaking at the launch of the report. And Matthew Lesh, who is Head of Research at the Adam Smith Institute. Welcome to you both. Vimla, let me start with you. You really think the UK's a more extreme form of capitalism than, say, the United States?
I think what we're trying to say is actually there's a case here at the moment for really transforming the way that business is set out and understanding how to deliver not just value for your shareholders, but society as a whole. So the way that we see capitalism at the moment needs to shift to not just be profit-driven, but purpose-driven as well, and that those two things can work in harmony to deliver good out into society.
But, I mean, if you look at the way that business is done in this country compared with, say, the US, I mean, corporate governance standards are generally tighter. You don't get CEOs running roughshod over their boards in the way that you occasionally do in the United States. You have higher levels of taxation and lower levels of executive pay.
Yeah, I agree. I think when we're looking at the kind of way businesses are structured, the governance is really important there. And I think what we're trying to say is the shift doesn't need to necessarily be around capitalism itself. It's just the governance structures that exist. So really shifting the way that we look at those governance structures to bring more accountability into how businesses operate. So
this is a sort of John McDonnell style, let's sweep away capitalism altogether. It's about making capitalism more effective and work for a wider number of people.
Absolutely, yeah.
Matthew, what do you make of that?
Look, I think we're really creating a false dichotomy here. The social purpose of a business is to deliver a profit. And we often say profit is a negative thing, but in fact, profit is really what you get by providing value to others, by providing a product whose value is higher than the sum of its parts. And I worry that when we put aside the system which has delivered literally billions of people out of poverty, has provided immense value to workers, to customers, and extraordinary innovation entrepreneurship, we're really throwing out what makes our system work so successfully. And we're risking something else. Because I think in the past what we've seen, and the reason why we saw this refocus towards shareholder capitalism was because we had a lot of corporate executives who were pretty stagnant, they weren't innovative, they weren't changing things, they actually needed a bit of a push by the owners of their capital. The problem is when you start having other priorities in a business, when you start talking about a wider public priority, you really lose that accountability. A business accountable to everybody is in fact accountable to nobody. And without that direct chain of accountability, from the shareholders, the investors, the capital, to the executives, I think you end up with quite problematic situations.
There's a very good line in this report, though, which says that the nature of companies has changed over the years, so that increasingly they're intangible. So, in other words, their assets are no longer necessarily buildings or machinery, it's more intellectual property, brands and patents, and therefore traditional methods of regulation and competition policy don't necessarily work anymore.
Well, I think when actually goods are less tangible, in fact, we have more competition because that means that, as a result, there's lower cost to entry. You don't need to invest in a massive factory to do a tech startup. You just need a bedroom and the ability to code. So it's actually different. It's a little bit more than that, of course.
You think a company like Google, there are no entry barriers to taking them on?
I think there are entry barriers, but I think they're much lower than you would have historically had to compete with Ford. Let's say if you're a car manufacturer, you can compete on all different ways with Google by providing, let's say, a better travel search site or a better restaurant search site. So we're actually seeing a lot of competition in the market. And I think the market, when it comes to online, is extremely strongly flourishing in the UK and really across the world.
I mean, Matthew did touch on something that struck me about this report, which is I don't see much in there about the good that businesses do, the wealth they create, the jobs they create, the fact that they've lifted millions of people out of poverty around the world.
I think that goes without saying. So the case here isn't that capitalism is wrong and that it leads to a fruitful economy, but it's saying that we are seeing a shift in society at the moment where people care more about what they're putting out into the world. And in a time of instability, we can start to really balance out the way that we manage both profit and purpose together.
What about Matthew's point on shareholders keeping businesses honest, as it were? Do you not think they're doing enough in that respect?
I don't think they're doing enough, and I think that's where really thinking about the governance structures that exist and how your shareholders can start to be brought in to hold companies accountable, not just for the profit, but the purpose as well. Those two things working together.
What do you think, Matthew? I mean, how would you toughen up corporate governance without necessarily, in your words, throwing the baby out with the bathwater?
I think the risk here of trying to change around the legislation is that you end up, rather than actually making companies more accountable to the public in general, you simply can make them more accountable to the state. If we look at Labor's manifesto, what they were talking about is changing around the purpose and meaning of companies and then creating a new kind of companies regulator that would then presumably have the power to tell companies how to operate their businesses and say, well, you're not acting in the wider public benefit. And I think that's quite a scary path to go along, because it would basically completely undermine the system in which businesses are able to provide for their customers and provide for their shareholders. So I think you end up with far more government intervention if you start changing around the governance structures, because ultimately it would be the government holding people to account rather than businesses and ultimately customers who currently hold businesses to account by deciding what they buy.
Vin, sorry, you wanted to come back on that?
I was going to say, I think there's an interesting point here around where customers fall into the general population society. So when we think about users, customers, the people that are interacting with your business, they're also citizens and people as well. So I think the kind of shifts that we're seeing in business is to kind of blur those lines together. And in order to be able to do that and to be held accountable not just to your shareholders but to society as a whole and to your users, your customers, something does need to change.